February 2025. While January had been defined by emergencies, February shifted the conversation to governance: who controls artificial intelligence, who defends Europe, and where Germany's political center of gravity had moved. 3 events, 3 questions. None with a clean answer. On February 10 and 11, world leaders converged in Paris for the AI Action Summit co-chaired by French President Emmanuel Macron and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Over 1,000 participants from more than 100 countries gathered to address a question no previous generation had faced: how do you govern a technology that is advancing faster than any institution can track? 58 countries signed a joint declaration on inclusive and sustainable AI. The language was carefully chosen: accessible, ethical, transparent, open. But 2 notable absences undercut the moment: the United States and the United Kingdom both declined to sign. The gap between signatories and non-signatories revealed exactly how divided the world is on AI's future. France moved beyond declarations. Macron announced a $400 million endowment for current AI new foundation backed by 9 governments, including India, Germany, and Kenya, alongside private partners like Google and Salesforce. The goal: fund public interest AI tools, open source infrastructure, and data stores that no single corporation would own, an attempt to carve out space between American big tech and Chinese state AI. The absence of the United States carried specific weight. The Trump administration had already revoked Biden-era executive orders on AI risk assessment within days of taking office. The Paris summit had been designed partly as a multilateral response to that shift. Without American participation, it became a declaration that the world's largest AI developer had no obligation to honor. Anthropic's Dario Amodi called the summit a quote missed opportunity. The air safety community agreed the declaration focused on accessibility and opportunity, not risk and governance. It was a document that most countries could sign precisely because it asked little of them. The harder conversation about liability, autonomous systems, and what happens when air fails at scale was deferred. The Paris Air Action Summit produced statements, commitments, and frameworks. What it did not produce was binding governance. Without a global agreement with teeth, the architecture of air development would continue to be shaped not by summits, but by the deployment decisions of a handful of companies and the export policies of 2 superpowers. The race had no referee. 4 days after Paris closed, the conversation shifted from air governance to something more immediate: the physical security of a continent that was no longer certain it could rely on the ally that had guaranteed it for 80 years. The 61st Munich Security Conference convened from February 14 to 16 under the theme of multipolar, the acknowledgement that the world was no longer organized around a single superpower, but around competing centers with incompatible interests. For European leaders, this year's conference carried unusual urgency. The United States had a new president, and the signals from Washington were unlike anything Europe had navigated since the Cold War. Vice President Vance arrived in Munich and delivered a speech that stunned the room. Rather than reaffirming the Atlantic Alliance, Vance lectured European leaders on free speech and democratic backsliding, warning them about censorship and election interference in their own countries. The message was clear: America under Trump was not interested in the role of European guardian. Europe would need to manage its own security. Ukraine dominated the conference floor. The core question: was Washington preparing to pressure Kyiv into negotiations requiring territorial concessions? Trump had already made contact with Moscow. European consensus held in Munich: Ukraine's sovereignty was non-negotiable. But that consensus meant little without American logistical and financial backing that was now explicitly in question. Germany's defense minister announced a joint initiative with France, Poland, Italy, and the United Kingdom to develop a roadmap for European defense capabilities independent of American support. The language was diplomatic. The subtext was not: Europe was beginning to plan for a future in which NATO's Article 5 guarantee could no longer be assumed. 80 years of American security provision were being repriced in real time. The Munich Security Conference had historically been a venue for alliance management. In February 2025, it became a diagnostic. The diagnosis: multipolarity had arrived. The transatlantic relationship was under structural stress, and Europe's window to build genuine strategic autonomy was narrow. The question was no longer whether Europe needed to act independently, it was whether it still had the time. The conference ended without binding outcomes, as it always does, but the mood was different from any previous year. European leaders flew home to draft emergency defense budgets, accelerate procurement agreements, and have conversations with their publics about what it would actually cost to defend themselves. A conference that usually managed alliances had in 2025 begun to prepare for their partial dissolution. 1 week after Munich, Germany, the continent's largest economy and the central player in any European defense framework, went to the polls, and the results reshaped the political map of Europe's most powerful nation. The election had been called early after Chancellor Olaf Scholz lost a parliamentary no-confidence vote in December 2024, the collapse of a 3-party coalition that had spent 3 years disagreeing on nearly everything. Germany was heading into the vote with a stagnating economy, rising energy costs, and a political center that had been eroding for years. The question was not just who would win, it was what the result would say about where Germany had moved. The center-right CDU won with 28.5%, but the story of the night was the alternative for Germany, the AfD, which finished second with an unprecedented 20.8%, the SPD, which had governed Germany for 3 years, collapsed to 16.4%, its worst result in the modern era. The political landscape had shifted in ways that would take months to fully absorb. The AfD's performance was the number Europe noticed. A party treated as too extreme to govern with too prominent to ignore had become the second largest in the German parliament. Its support was concentrated in the east, in economically anxious regions where distrust of established parties ran deepest. The firewall held, the AfD was excluded from coalition talks, but 20% of the German electorate had voted for it anyway. STU leader Friedrich Merz moved to form a coalition ultimately with the SPD, the party that had just suffered a historic defeat. The arithmetic left few options. Merz had repeatedly ruled out governing with the AfD. The remaining parties couldn't produce a stable majority without SPD participation. The result was a government built on mutual necessity rather than shared vision, familiar ground for German coalition politics, but with less margin for error. For Europe, a Merz-led Germany signaled a shift in tone, more assertive on defense spending, more skeptical of open-ended commitments without a diplomatic track. Merz had already caused controversy before the election by working with the AfD to pass an immigration bill breaking a long-standing parliamentary taboo. Is Germany would be consequential, complicated, and central to every major European debate in the years ahead. The German election didn't produce a crisis, it produced a realignment. The political coalition that had governed Europe's largest democracy for a generation was gone. A new majority had taken its place, built from different constituencies, carrying different instincts, and facing a continent that after Munich had just been told it was largely on its own. 3 events, 1 month, a global air summit without the world's largest air power, a security conference where the alliance that won the Cold War began drafting its own contingency plans, and an election that moved Germany, and with it, Europe onto a new political footing. February 2025 was a month of recalibration. Every institution that had defined the post-war order was being asked the same question: are you still fit for what comes next?